Hey everybody, it's Tyler Esselman.
And Michael Osinski.
And you are listening to This One Goes to 11.
This One Goes to 11, the podcast where we invite someone to share an album with us that they believe is perfect.
So perfect, in fact. The 10 out of 10 just isn't good enough. It's insufficient. It simply won't do.
It won't do.
It won't do.
As we say.
And we're still here in Chicago, still in...
You said that as if you're like, oh, we're still here, which is not the case. We are grateful to be with each other.
If you've heard the other two episodes, you know that's not my sentiment. You're very clear on that. Yeah, so very, very happy to still be here in town doing some in-person recordings. We got a few more to go, and another amazing guest today. Somebody who, not for lack of interest in having him as a guest, he's pinch hitting today for somebody. You know, schedules happen. We understand that. And but we're really happy to have.
He was on the list to be on.
He was.
Anyway.
Yes.
We just moved him up.
Believe it or not,
we moved him up.
But yes, we have an amazing guest today. Michael, who are we speaking to?
We're speaking to Jason Beck.
Jason Beck. Jason Beck grew up in Oklahoma City, but moved to Chicago for college and has never left. As a creative, he's an actor, director, producer, photographer, and administrator, and is currently the assistant dean at the theater school at DePaul University. You might have heard of it.
No, we've talked.
A lifelong Cubs fan. That's for me, and I see you, Jason. He lives in Chicago with his wife, Mitsu, and his two daughters, Ada and Elliot. And he's sitting right here. Jason, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Very, very excited to have you. We go pretty far back, even before my time at DePaul. I was reminiscing when I got off at the Fullerton stop about the afternoon. I think it must be about 14 years ago now when I took my tour at the theater school, led by one Mr. Dan Johnson.
Oh, yes.
But I was greeted by you. And I think that was probably the first time we met, right?
That sounds right. Yeah.
An ambassador of Michael's and my alma mater, and your alma mater too. I mean, you went there.
Yeah, and clearly the tour went well. We closed the deal. We got you there.
You did. You got coffee that day. Coffee's for closers.
That's right. Yeah.
You closed the deal here. So we're very excited to have you, Jason. This is the TTS representation needs to continue apace on the pod, and you've brought an album I never could have expected, but I'm so excited about it, and I'll tell you why I never could have expected it. But Jason, tell us, what album hast thou brought before the This One Goes to 11 tribunal today?
I have brought INXS Kick.
Yes.
All right.
Michael's reaction when I got the text that was the album you were nominating was positive.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was surprised because it was one of those albums that I know this was a big album,
mm-hmm.
but I think people have forgotten them. It's got some bangers on
mm-hmm.
here. We gotta be real here. It was a very well-selling album. And I thought someone would bring it forward at some point. I just didn't know when. I mean, Jason, you and I don't know each other super well. So in terms of musical selections, you could have said the soundtrack to Anything Goes, and I would have been like, great, cool, let's do it.
Sure, I wouldn't have surprised you.
Yeah, no, but here we go, INXS. So
I agree. They are in the wake of all of the tragedy around this band, probably diminished in reputation, I think. But it's really interesting to go back and read about them. But I did that. You all probably didn't do that out there, so it's okay that you didn't go and do some research beforehand, because we have a convenient feature on this podcast to bring you up to speed, and everybody loves it, don't they, Michael?
You love it, and you are forcing your love for this segment onto our public.
And what's that segment called, Michael?
Why you always have me do it? Tyler, it is called The Beginner's Guide to INXS's Kick in 60 Seconds.
I do end up serving that one up to you. We should flip that around. We should flip that script.
I don't know. Sometimes flipping things doesn't go well for the two of us.
That's fair. But anyway, you've taken up the task today,
mm-hmm.
Jason. Before you get to really kind of start in on your case, you'll get to assess how Michael does summarizing INXS and Kick in 60 seconds. All right?
Fantastic. Can't wait.
Excellent. All right, Michael, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
I've got 60 seconds on the clock.
Mm-hmm.
We're starting in 3, 2, 1, go.
Do you remember Dr. Dolphin? How about the Ferris brothers? No? That's because the three Australian brothers, along with their Jagger-esque frontman Michael Hutchence and two other friends, wisely changed their band's name to INXS a few years after forming in 1977 and before supporting fellow Aussies Midnight Oil in the early 80s. They also avoided becoming a Christian rock band, but that's another story. They exploded across the globe with their 1986 hit, What You Need, from Listen Like Thieves. Intent on capitalizing on their success and making an album where every song could be a single, they sent their two main songwriters, Hutchins and Andrew Ferris, to Hong Kong to write hits. And in 1987, they released their sixth album, Kick, which blended their developing pop rock sound with a bit of funk, went platinum 6 times over, and spawned 4 top 10 singles. Bobby Christgau didn't buy it, calling them, quote, silly, danceable rock and roll. One more hit album and a few misses would follow before Hutchins took his own life in 1997. And though the band replaced Hutchins, they unfortunately would never reach the same success they enjoyed in the 80s and the 90s.
I wanted to let it really like that. You had some breathing room there.
I also
good.
To be honest, I jumped a line in my writing, and Bobby Christgau called them, quote, silly middlebrow hacks, yet praised their, quote, danceable rock and roll. So.
Nice, yes.
We're a little so on Bobby Christgau on this pod.
I think there was also a point at which they were almost called themselves the Vegetables too, which is not a great band name either. So.
No, that is
great.
That does not work out very well.
No, INXS is better. So, Jason, tell us how would you assess Michael's job summarizing this band? In whatever terms seem right to you?
I mean, I think that you packed quite a bit into 60 seconds specifically about this album. So, I think that's, Tyler and I are big baseball fans, talk baseball. I think you knocked it out of the park on that.
Okay.
Knocked it out of the park there.
I know enough about baseball to know what that means.
You got a dinger. Right. There you go.
I know a surprising amount about sports.
Strictly dingers around here, guys. Strictly dingers. All right. So we got a home run on the board.
Well, before we dive into the album, though, Jason, we do like to ask all our guests a question about themselves, specifically what their relationship to music is. So what's your relationship to music, past and present?
I get this comment all the time. I always have music playing in my office, and all day long, all the time, underscoring my life. It's very eclectic. It's all over the place, but it's always been important to me. I think about shows I've directed. I'm always trying to plug as much music into shows as possible. I just feel like it's, it really kind of is an underscoring of sort of, emotion and sort of feelings for me at all times. Yeah. And so it's always been important, and I've always been all over the map a little bit with music, which I think is why maybe this surprised you a little bit as a pick. Early on, music started for me by knowing what I didn't like, which was that I grew up, my parents are country western fans. And so very early on, it was a lot of country western. And I like classic country. We're talking like, Patsy Cline, Hank Williams, that kind of 70s, 60s, 70s. By the time I was coming into my own liking music, I was sort of very anti-country because it was what my parents listened to. And so our family sort of compromise was always like the oldies station. So we would listen to KOMA 1520 in Oklahoma City. And it was always like 50s and like early 60s stuff. And so that always was, that's always been sort of an underpinning of my music interests. Yeah. I grew up with that.
Kind of classic rock and roll sort of stuff.
Exactly. And Motown and Elvis and that kind of coming of age rock and roll stuff.
There are people out there who don't like Motown. I don't want to know who they are. Yeah. Just want to put that out there, listeners.
Motown is American music, right? That's
absolutely.
I think there's probably, I'm no musicologist, but I think I could write a paper on that one.
But when I started coming into my own sort of interest in music, when I was like, early teens or 4th, 5th, 6th grade, I think a lot of it was, it was top 40, obviously, because that's what you could get at the time. But I had a good friend who had 2 older brothers who were sort of really into, like, at that time, I think we knew it as like 80s alternative. It was kind of that late new wave, new romantic stuff. And I just thought they were the coolest guys. I had an older sister. We had very different musical tastes. So I was really like looked up to my friend's older brothers. And so I really kind of got into the things that they were in at that time and getting them to like dub off cassette tapes of what they were listening to. And that was, a lot of stuff like The Cure and The Smiths and, early 9 Inch Nails, that kind of stuff. And I think like if we want to get to INXS, I think where sort of I liked that stuff. I think the very first cassette that I ever bought with my own money was actually Kissing to Be Clever, Culture Club.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, it was very eclectic at that time. But I always sort of also liked rock, right? There was a rock part. So I think INXS for me, where we get to INXS, if you want to answer that question, I think that it sort of is landed in the blend of that sort of 80s alternative but rock under it. So like I remember getting cassette dubs of their early stuff. So like Listen Like Thieves and Shabu Shaba and that kind of stuff. I had those before I ever owned an actual purchased like an INXS album, and Kick was the first album I actually purchased, clean, my own.
It was yours. Yeah.
Yes.
Legal.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Of INXS. And it's, we've talked about this a little bit, I think, whenever I make the case, but this is also I think the only album maybe that I've owned in every format. For myself.
Yes.
Like vinyl as well?
Yeah, but not first. First I owned the cassette.
Yeah.
Then I got the vinyl later. Then when I got a CD player for the first time, this was the first CD I purchased to replace my well-worn cassette.
Ooh, yeah.
So that I could take it on the into the car on the CD Walkman. And then, one of the first albums I bought on my iPod,
Yeah.
And certainly, have streaming now. So I think it's the only album I think I've ever owned in every format.
This is something that's come up before, is like people who are saying, well, I had to have a version of it for every occasion. I had to have, no matter where I was, I had to be able to play this. And this is what these damn rectangles have ruined for us, haven't they? It's coming. Now my rectangle can emit that song, and I want a little bit more substance to it, even if it's a CD. I have a bunch of jewel case CDs in my truck that just kind of rattle around, and it's sort of become the sound. The rattling of the jewel cases is you miss that when you're just playing music on your phone.
And you guys have also talked about, I know previously on other episodes, about the sort of fun and like the nostalgia of reading the jewel case covers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, don't really get that anymore.
Was Kicks good? Do you remember?
I don't think it was super extensive, if I remember correctly. I feel like the cassette cover that you rolled out had actually more to it than the actual jewel. Almost
like a little chapbook, kind of.
I think a lot of albums that were made to be put on cassette, like the art was designed to work for that. So when everything suddenly started going back to CDs, it was like, how do you convert that art? And I doubt that record companies are being like, oh, I know, let's devote some of our money to having people reimagine art for a different format, because
why would they do that?
Yeah, that would cost money. Why would we do that? So yeah.
But were you making any music as a kid? Were you like ever in any bands or?
No, I mean, I flirted with the piano for a while, but stopped for baseball season. I never really I never really played a musical instrument with any longevity or of any real substance. I wouldn't count myself a musician in any sense of the word.
Good. Okay. Neither will I then. And I don't count myself as one either. So you're in good company there. Okay. So yeah, let's talk about, you talked a little bit about how this was like, how you discovered this album and like how it has, it came down the pipeline from those friends, brothers, which that's a very important music relationship, is the siblings of your friends, because generally they can fill in the gaps, right? Like Steely Dan, I didn't get from my dad, I got that from my friends' dads. So that's an important musical lineage that we shouldn't discount. So tell us a little bit more about like what it was about Kick in particular that kicked you in the head, as it were.
Well, because I had some of their earlier albums sort of already in my consciousness, because I had cassette dubs of them, and I was like 11 when this came out, 12, so I wasn't clearly a sophisticated at this point music lover of any kind. But I remember this was an album that I anticipated, like I was looking forward to. It's one of the first ones I can remember like thinking, oh, this album is coming. Like I know they're making a new album. I can't wait till I get this new music. So, when it started releasing singles, which you would hear again on Top 40. And then I just remember anticipating, really wanting the album, and then getting it pretty early on. I don't think I was there like when it dropped, but pretty early on, being able to get the cassette, and then sitting in my room listening to the album from top to bottom, and just like one of my initial thoughts about this album. I can remember thinking this very early on, and again, I'm probably adding more sophistication to the thought in hindsight.
Do it.
But just thinking like there's not a skippable song.
There you go.
On this album,
Okay.
So it's a song that I feel like, it's an album that I feel like in various forms and various times in my life that I've listened to it and come back to it, it's like one of those albums that you listen to start to finish every time. It's actually a relatively short album too.
It is.
Yeah, I think it's under 40 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like a car ride, commute album almost you can listen to, but there's not like a skippable song in it.
Yeah.
Every song, I feel like every song, is it pops in its own way. To me, it's one of those seminal albums for me personally. There's a lot of nostalgia attached to this because I just remember, getting it and then really enjoying it and then feeling like I knew something that other people didn't know, because a lot of my friends at the time didn't know this, band, didn't know this music.
Sure.
And so it felt like something I could kind of have as my, whether it was or not, it felt like I could be cool around having Kick, this album. I guarantee you that Never Tear Us Apart was probably on every single mixtape I ever made a girl in junior high and high school.
Choice. Good choice.
So there's also just a lot of nostalgia around this album for me personally. But I still think, I believe that as an album, it stands the test of time as a perfect album.
Not to make a blanket statement about a region of our country, but do you
go right ahead?
But
what region are you going to call this? Is the other question. This is
I'm just going to call it the state of Oklahoma. So I'm going to call it.
Sure.
I'm just like, is that? Do you think that the fact that like a lot of your friends, INXS wasn't reaching whether it was your area or like your generation or whatnot? Like, do you think that had anything to do with it?
Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's why I thought like my friends' brothers were just super cool, because there was something that was so different about the music they were listening to that most people that were in my friend group or around knew. I mean, most people, it was top 40 and it was, country or stuff that, pop, right? I think that there was something sort of subversive a little bit about this album too. Like, this album is, I was, like I said, I was like 12, 13, 11, 12, 13 when listening to this album in its prime. There's something very sexual about this album, right? There's a lot of sex in this album, unsaid, right? Just unconscious or like, subtext. And I think that, thinking about me listening to this album right in the prime of puberty, like makes sense to me, right? I just, in preparing for this, I went back and we watched some of the music videos again. Like some of these videos, like Devil Inside video, like it actually might get censored today.
Yeah.
Like, there's like, it's very sexual.
Yeah.
And you think about like, that was like in 1988, you feel like how could that have been, out there? This album was right in the prime time of like MTV music video, right? So it was made from MTV in a lot of ways.
Michael Hutchence was a beautiful, beautiful man.
Absolutely.
I like re-listening to this. I was, sometimes when I listen to old albums for the podcast, I'm like, oh, maybe that's when I became gay. I think like, oh, maybe he was one of the the things that sort of pushed me there. But yeah, I mean, he had like I said, Jagger-esque in the intro, because he had that charisma about him. And I know he wasn't the only member of the band, but he was clearly the face of the band.
I think, Michael, you're right. Thinking Jagger-esque. I think, Michael Hutchence is also sort of heir apparent to Jim Morrison and the Doors. Like, there's a sort of like sexual and androgyny about him that's like, that I think was attractive to a lot of people. Kind of a quintessential, I think, 80s frontman in some ways. Late 80s frontman, at least.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Did your parents have much say or awareness of what kind of music you were listening to? And do you feel like was the sexual nature of this album subtextual enough for them that you maybe it like wouldn't have been like strange for you listening to an album like that at this time, at this age?
It's interesting because like I don't think of my parents as being very controlling of like what my sister and I listen to, like especially like in closed bedroom. They wouldn't want to listen to, they wouldn't have been interested in this being what we're listening to in the whole house or in the car, because it just wasn't their thing. Again, the first album I ever bought was the Culture Club album. And I remember, not so much from parents, but I feel like that there was like, again, growing up in Oklahoma, I think there was sort of, there was an idea around something like Culture Club and Boy George, and it was queer, it was different. And so I remember like there being like, not outright bullying, but like, people making fun of, me, maybe even for having that album or listening, but I don't remember it like stopping me or like being like, I'm not going to listen to this or whatever.
Good on you.
Yeah. And I don't think that like, I felt like there's any like parents didn't like it maybe, or it wasn't their music, but they didn't keep me from listening to it. And I think actually maybe it was just subversive enough, the sexuality of this album, that it was maybe just subversive enough that they didn't get it.
This is the thing, is we've always had gyrating musicians, and we always will have gyrating musicians, and they just look different in each era. So this is great that your parents didn't meddle in your like musical exposure in that sense, right? They had their subtextually sexual artists as well.
So
and
who's the gyrating artist of 2020s? Harry Styles?
How much time you got?
They're
all gyrating.
I mean, like, are we talking like a Megan Thee Stallion level gyrating?
Yeah. I think
okay.
I think we get that. I mean, you could even say like SZA with, like SZA's kind of like the sexuality of her albums, like those are kind of like explicitly expressed and implicitly expressed, right? Like those things exist on both levels. They're
I bet SZA's like a slow gyration.
Yeah, exactly.
She's taking an edible, and
this is more like INXS is more like quick gyrating, and like because it does get what I found fascinating about kind of like learning about what this sound is, because it does sort of just sound like the 80s to me. Okay. Is like there's a very
those horns,
quintessentially 80s sound, but then if you dig more into that and you kind of like try to uncover on a musical level what this particular mixture of sounds is. This term pub rock coming up, like it being an Australian sort of modality of 80s pop, if you will. Whenever we hear about stuff like this, it always kind of blows my mind. In the Southern Hemisphere, there's this whole, like obviously globalization is an unstoppable force at this point. But the fact that there's still this room in the world, or at least there was at this time, for INXS to be gigantic in the Southern Hemisphere, to just be one of the biggest rock bands in the entire world, and for them to then come to the United States and like it take a while for that it didn't translate directly, I guess, in some ways. And it makes sense why you would find them kind of like special for you in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's very time and place, right? But as I think that the critics of INXS, I think, to make the counter argument here a little bit first, I think there's there are people that will say that INXS is capitalizing on things other people had already done, right?
Totally.
Like Duran Duran and and other artists that come in early in their 80s. I would say that I think that INXS is learning and then taking it up a notch in what they're presenting, right? And there's some, you think about, they're a big band too. They're a big rock band, relatively, right? Yeah, a lot of musicians, but they're also just really, they are really fantastic musicians, and so they do have a lot they can throw, and they throw everything into this album. There's horns, there's strings, there's exactly synths,
great synths,
a lot of guitar. There's actually quite a few, I think, sort of quintessential, like really recognizable guitar riffs in this album. That you immediately recognize, and so I think you could say it's them trying to make a commercial album. I think it's just them finding their actual like musical voice and where they want it to be, and that they were doing this. They're maybe taking some things that others had done, learning from it. And I don't think it's derivative, though. I think it's actually adding to it. It's additive, and and they were already doing their thing, as you said, Tyler, in Australia for a long time,
for years,
and just didn't break out really worldwide until right before this album.
As people in the performing arts, we know that there's this sort of like minuscule portion of people who will ever affect audiences on that level. And it also goes to show you that there's this sort of strata. We obviously pay attention to the biggest global superstars at any given point in time. Like right now, your Taylors and your Beyoncés and the rest of them. But at all. But it also, I think INXS illustrates that strata of band that touches it and kind of actually touches it for quite some time, and then pretty much falls away through a lot of circumstances out of their control, but sort of exists in a very liminal space between super mega stardom, legends of music, and also sort of like the bands that could have been.
Yeah, and I think, it also, you have to put, again, time and place, right? It was very different in the 80s about how you could discover music. There were a lot of gatekeepers, right? You think about like now, they might have exploded a little earlier because just there's more access to music from all over the world, right?
Yeah.
At the time, like if you didn't get on the American Top 40, you didn't get onto MTV. I think what helped them was that we can talk a lot about Michael Hutchence, I think, and how the band changed because of his death and what they could have been had he not died. He was kind of made for MTV, right? And so I think that's what helped them get noticed and explode the way they did eventually.
Got to have your Jagger.
Well, we've been talking about the band and the album sort of as a whole. Let's talk about specific tracks. Specifically, what do you think is the standout track from this album?
For me, the standout track for this album is Devil Inside.
Well, why don't we just a smidge, just a little smidge.
What's that sound like?
Just a little bit. Here's what it sounds like.